Hello and welcome, I'm Thomas Porteous and you're watching NewsX World. Let's take a look at some of the top stories this hour. Iran threatens retaliation after the US joins Israel in striking nuclear sites, including a bunker buster that hit on Fordow. As missiles fly towards Israel, Trump floats regime change, protests erupt in US cities, and oil markets brace for the Strait of Hormuz closure. Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi arrives in Moscow for talks with Russian leaders after yesterday's US strikes on Iranian nuclear sites. State media says he'll discuss regional tensions and coordinate a response to aggression by the United States and Israel. At least 22 people are dead and 63 are injured after a gunman opened fire and detonated a suicide vest inside a church in Damascus, Syria. The attacker, linked to Islamic State, struck during Sunday service in the city's first major blast since Assad's fall. Russian strikes hit Kyiv overnight, killing 4 and injuring several as drones buzzed overhead in multiple waves, officials say. The attack comes as peace talks remain frozen and Ukraine vows to step up retaliatory strikes on Russia. Hundreds rally in The Hague to protest against NATO, military spending and a potential war with Iran, just days before a major alliance summit. Iranian demonstrators joined calls for peace, urging leaders to invest in peace and not war. Colombia's army says 57 troops were seized by civilians under pressure from FARC dissidents in a mountainous cocaine-rich area near El Platedo. The region remains a hotspot in Colombia's ongoing conflict, with tensions rising amid rebel activity. A judge has granted bail to Kilmar Obredo Garcia, a migrant wrongly deported to El Salvador, now awaiting trial on smuggling charges. But despite the ruling, Obredo may still be held in immigration detention, pending further action. A day after recommending Trump for the Nobel Peace Prize, Pakistan slammed his decision to strike Iranian nuclear sites, calling it a violation of international law. Islamabad warned that escalating tensions could have severely damaging consequences for the region and beyond. Our top story today, President Trump is hailing what he calls a monumental strike on Iran's nuclear sites, claiming satellite images show extensive damage, including 2 deeply buried facilities. Trump, posting on Truth Social, said the sites were obliterated, describing a direct hit on what he called the heart of Iran's nuclear program. But questions remain over whether the US strikes destroyed most of Iran's enriched nuclear material, as official assessments are still underway. Trump has also questioned the possibility of a regime change in Iran. Through a post on social media, he said he wants Iran to be great again. Meanwhile, the State Department has issued a worldwide caution for US citizens, citing travel disruptions and potential anti-American protests following the escalation. Trump will meet his national security team tomorrow in the Oval Office. He's delayed his trip to the NATO summit in The Hague by a day, a move that reflects the gravity of the crisis. And as the fallout unfolds, Russia's former president, Dmitry Medvedev, says Trump has pushed America into another war, even warning that some nations may now provide Iran with nuclear warheads. On the other hand, anti-war protests have erupted across the US and around the world after President Trump's strikes on Iran's nuclear sites. Demonstrators in New York, Washington, D.C. and Los Angeles called the attacks war crimes and demanded an end to US military action. We're now joined by Ross Feingold, political risk analyst located in Taipei, Taiwan. Ross, there's plenty of people, protests going on around the world, calling this a war crime. They're citing that international law is being broken here. Does that have any weight now in this day and age?
Zero. This will have no effect on Trump's decision-making if President Trump deems it's necessary to take further action. Now, legally, that may or may not be the correct answer. But again, people protesting, whether domestically in the United States or in other parts of the world, that by itself is not going to have any impact whatsoever on President Trump's decision-making or the advice that he receives from his national security team. Frankly, that's just the reality.
Yes, and also, Ross, obviously the information is a bit muddy coming out of Iran, and given the secrecy around the Fordo and Natanz bases, how plausible is it that deeply buried stockpiles of enriched uranium were truly obliterated? I mean, we've seen images of all these trucks leaving the sites. Some people from Iran are saying that that is some of the enriched uranium. How credible are Trump's statements to saying that Iran's nuclear program has truly been completely destroyed?
Well, President Trump certainly likes to use the word obliterated. Whether or not that actually occurred in this situation really depends on those assessments that you mentioned that are still ongoing at present. But I think it's clear that the facilities have suffered a tremendous amount of damage. They're probably inoperable, perhaps permanently. At the same time, it's possible that Iran, in the days preceding the attack, they may have shipped out some of the equipment or some of the uranium. That would have just been a prudent move, given that these are logical targets for the United States to attack. So it might very well be a combination of both. But I think we should have no doubt that Iran's nuclear weapons program has suffered tremendous damage, first from the attacks by the Israelis, including the assassination of some of Iran's top nuclear scientists, and now with the very likely destruction of these facilities by the United States. They've certainly been set back. And I think any statements that Iran makes saying that they haven't been set back are frankly not true.
Yes, and Trump has hinted Iran should, quote, make Iran great again. This obviously signals an active push for regime change, something that he spoke out against previously. What are your thoughts on this new political messaging by Donald Trump?
I think that the analysis is a bit more nuanced. President Trump is not necessarily calling for regime change, and certainly he's not going to put U.S. troops on the ground to invade Iran like the United States did in Afghanistan or Iraq in the early part of this century. We have to keep in mind that President Trump, his foreign policy, it's not about bringing democracy to other countries. We know this, for example, from his recent trip to the Gulf countries, where he was happy to make deals with those countries. Those countries aren't democracies, they're monarchies. So I think President Trump would have preferred that Iran had taken the deal that was on offer, which would include uranium for civilian nuclear power plants that was produced outside of Iran and shipped into Iran. And in return, the sanctions would have come off, and Iran could have resumed doing business with other countries, and it would have been a huge help to the economy of Iran, and it would have certainly helped the Iranian leadership with some of the pressure they face domestically, that the sanctions have such an effect on economic growth, which leads to a lot of frustration in the middle class and above in Iran. So I think what President Trump means when he says make Iran great again is just to resume its place as a somewhat normal member of the international community, even if it's not a democracy. Again, bringing democracy to Iran is not a priority for President Trump, but he would have been happy to make a deal on the terms offered by the United States where the sanctions would have come off and Iran could resume its economic and trade relationship with other countries.
Ross Feingold, thank you very much. You are staying with us. We have more related developments. Tensions are rising across the globe after the United States struck Iran's nuclear sites. Iran's allies, including North Korea, have issued strong statements. North Korea has condemned the strike, accusing the US of exploiting the security interests of sovereign states. Meanwhile, European leaders are calling for calm. France, Germany and the United Kingdom have urged Iran not to escalate the situation and to return to talks over its nuclear program. Australia has thrown its support behind the US action, saying the world cannot allow Iran to obtain a nuclear weapon. Prime Minister Anthony Albanese said Iran's uranium enrichment to 60% had no civilian purpose. Let's take a listen in to the Australian Prime Minister.
Has long agreed that Iran cannot be allowed to get a nuclear weapon, and we support action to prevent that, and that is what this is. The US action was directed at specific sites central to Iran's nuclear program. We don't want escalation and a full-scale war. We continue to call for dialogue and for diplomacy. As I've said for many days now, we are deeply concerned about any escalation in the region, and we want to see diplomacy, dialogue and de-escalation.
The IAEA recently reported that Iran now possesses enough enriched uranium for up to 9 nuclear weapons, if purified further. As diplomatic efforts intensify, regional stability hangs in the balance. We're once again joined by Ross Feingold to discuss this in more detail. Ross, I want to talk about Russia first, which we've mentioned previously. The former Medvedev has suggested some states might transfer nuclear warheads to Iran. Which states could he mean, and how realistic is that threat?
Frankly, I don't know which states he means, and his threat is probably unrealistic. The likelihood that North Korea or even Russia would send nuclear weapons to Iran at the moment is probably pretty small. So the reaction from Russia over the past few days has been mostly angry words, but are they going to send weapons or to Iran? Not at the moment. They need whatever weapons they have for their own war in Ukraine. So it's not a surprising reaction from Russia, a lot of bellicosity, a lot of angry words, the leadership taking to social media. President Putin will probably say some things to the press as well. But I think that's mostly just talk because Russia is too busy with the war in Ukraine at the moment.
Yes, and Ross, we've seen Abbas Araghchi and his delegation first of all head to Europe, and now he is in Moscow. What are your thoughts behind these negotiations? Diplomacy still active in regards to this. However, US talks have come to a close since these strikes. How much power does diplomacy now still have in this situation, if any?
Well, that goes back to the point about the deal on the table, which is a good deal for Iran. If Iran is being honest, if their nuclear program truly is only for civilian nuclear power purposes, then they should accept the deal that the United States and Western countries have proposed, which is that uranium would be enriched outside of Iran and shipped into Iran for use in civilian nuclear power plants. And that's probably the message he received in Europe. I don't really know what Russia could tell him. Maybe it would be in Russia's own interest to tell Iran, just hold out, keep on fighting the Americans, don't give in to the deal proposed by the United States. But that's probably mostly talk. Russia being busy with its war. I mean, they do send money to Iran in return for drones, and that's been well documented during the course of the war in Ukraine. But in a way, that's a little bit of financial help and a bunch of moral help from Russia. But that's not really going to help Iran. If Iran continues to be belligerent, if it doesn't reach a deal with the United States and the Western countries, it might very well get bombed again by the United States. And clearly Israel is continuing its military campaign against Iran at the moment. So it's up to the Iranian leadership to make a smart decision. And I don't think they're going to get very good advice from Russia at the moment.
Yes, Ross, and finally, one of Iran's allies, Pyongyang, has spoken out against the American strikes. But does this condemnation carry any real weight, or is it merely theatre?
This is mostly theater. This is kind of like the protests in some places in the United States or around the world. It's going to have zero impact on the decision-making of President Trump or the advice he receives from his advisors. But one thing to watch now that President Trump has been in office several months, anything that comes out of North Korea, we also have to keep in mind the possibility of a resumption of those Trump-Kim talks and the relationship they had during President Trump's first term. So there might be some angry words that come out of North Korea, but I think Kim Jong-un is still hoping he could resume that relationship with President Trump.
Ross Feingold, thank you very much for joining us. We have more on this developing story. Iran activates air defences over Tehran as fresh blasts are heard across the capital. Officials say over 200 sites in Iran have been hit by Israeli strikes since June the 13th. 3 civilians died after an Israeli missile struck an ambulance reportedly. 9 Revolutionary Guards were killed in Israeli raids on military bases in Yazd. Air defense systems also engaged targets over northwest Iran with explosions near Tabriz. In response, Iran launched a new wave of missiles at Israel, targeting Ben Gurion Airport and military infrastructure. Officials call it Iran's 20th wave of retaliatory strikes. At least 23 people have been wounded in Israel so far. Tehran's top advisor warned that any country hosting attackers will face retaliation. The Iranian foreign minister is in Moscow for emergency talks. Meanwhile, the IAEA are set to hold a crisis meeting today as fears of wider conflict grow. Meanwhile, France is evacuating its citizens from Israel amid the ongoing conflict. Until now, over 65,000 Israelis have returned home by air, sea and land crossings. Here's what the Israeli Transport Minister, Miri Regev, had to say.
עד היום חזרו ארצה מעל ל-65,000 איש, וזאת על פי נתוני מרשם האוכלוסין. הן חזרו דרך הים, דרך האוויר ודרך המעברים היבשתיים. בתחילת המבצע היו בין 100 ל-150 אלף ישראלים בחול. בואו ניקח את המספר 150 אלף. זאת אומרת שהיום אנחנו עומדים על פחות מ-100 אלף, אנחנו עומדים על 84 אלף ישראלים שנמצאים בחול.
We're now joined by Walter Anderson, political analyst located in the USA, to discuss this further. Walter, given these US strikes yesterday, air warfare between both Iran and Israel has been ongoing after a reported 200 Israeli strikes since June the 13th. What red line would push Iran from missile salvos to all-out war?
Well, they're getting close to that now. The issue with Iran, however, is its defenses have been much weakened. In fact, the reports are that the air over Tehran, in fact, anywhere in Iran, is now open to Israeli attack. And when the Israelis, since the American bombing of the 3 nuclear reactors and research facilities, has only increased, in fact. So it's so far it's not proved to be all that much a major impact. Though there has been, some of the material, the drones and others are getting through, but it's still relatively minor in comparison to what the larger issue that the Israelis have in mind. The important thing about all of this is it's really weakened the Iranian position in the Middle East. It's lost the support of its major client groups, the Hezbollah, Hamas, and even to a certain extent the Houthis in Yemen. And its own defenses have been much weakened. In fact, if reports are true, the Iranian counterattacks are getting weaker and weaker virtually with each one that's involved. My guess is there's still considerable popular reaction in Iran against this regime. We've seen that in the last several years. There have been periodic, breakouts. This can only dramatically impact negatively on the economy of Iran, which means dramatically impact on the lives of people. So the question is, to what extent will this regime, the Iranian regime, react to this? I mean, Trump has held out, as has the NATO allies and others as well, who have taken a pro-U.S. position, that to keep open the door of negotiations. Even though, as you know, the news has related that Trump has raised the possibility of regime change, though not as a goal. The goal is still the U.S. objective is one: Iran cannot have a nuclear weapon. Which is actually probably a rather smart way to look at this, because it has support outside of necessarily the pro-U.S. stand. I'm sure if you go into the Persian Gulf states, even though the leaders have sort of sent messages of ceasefire and sympathy for Iran publicly, privately, my guess is they're not all that sympathetic, because many of them, like Saudi Arabia and others, have had long-standing issues and tensions with Iran. And so, my guess is that they would want, the situation to calm down. Certainly that the Straits of Hormuz not be blocked, as the parliamentary commission in Iran has suggested. That would be like shooting itself in the foot. It would only increase the economic issues that Iran faces. Because let's face it, the one area where it's able to get any kind of financial backing is from the sale of its oil and gas.
Yes, and Walter, you briefly mentioned it there about Iran's defences being severely weakened. However, the world awaits Iran's retaliation to yesterday's US strikes. What kind of military capabilities does Iran still have amid this Israeli barrage of attacks?
Well, the barrage of attacks is continuing, and in fact, not only Israeli but other reports indicate the skies over Iran are virtually open. So the Israelis are picking off one after the other, and the question is whether they begin to move against other targets, which has some Israelis have suggested they ought to, because the charges that Iran has focused on civilian targets, whereas the Israelis say that they have focused on military targets, though there's collateral damage in that case as well. And the Israelis could start stepping up, attacks that would severely undermine the Iranian economy, and that would have a political impact within Iran itself.
Yes, and we've seen the Iranian parliament also vote to close the Strait of Hormuz. What financial, economic implications will that have on the international community and on world trade?
Well, it would certainly, in fact, you've seen that already. To a certain extent, gas prices and oil prices have gone up as well. But my guess is Iran cannot afford to do this too much, because it would then lose whatever avenues it had to economic growth and the economy. And most of its economy depends on the sale of oil and gas. It has a lot of that, but that's about all it has. It has, other than that, it doesn't have much that would operate, on the international market. So, even though the Parliamentary Commission has proposed that, whether or not it does that, we'll see if wiser heads prevail in this case. And I think this would be shooting yourself in the foot if they do something like that.
Walter Anderson, thank you very much. You are staying with us. We have another related development. The United Nations Security Council has held an emergency session following the US-led strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities, sparking global condemnation and deep divisions among world powers. While the US and Israel defended the strikes as necessary to prevent a nuclear Iran, Russia, China and Pakistan have proposed a resolution demanding an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. This is what both the US and Israel stated.
This operation sought to eliminate a long-standing but rapidly escalating source of global insecurity and to aid our ally Israel in our inherent right of collective self-defense, consistent with the UN Charter. For 40 years, the Iranian government has called for death to America and death to Israel, and posed a constant menace to the peace and security of its neighbors, the United States, and the entire world. Iran has attacked Israel with hundreds of ballistic missiles and through terrorist proxies. For decades, Iran has been responsible for misery and countless deaths across the Middle East.
The United States of America struck Iran's nuclear sites at Fordo, Natanz, and Isfahan. The United States, the leader of the free world, removed the greatest existential threat facing the free world. Just like our Operation Rising Lion, this was not a war of choice. This action was a necessity. It was a righteous act for the United States, for Israel, for the Middle East, and for the world.
Now, the United Nations Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned the region is teetering on the edge of a deadly downward spiral. Rafael Grossi, the IAEA chief, has also expressed hope that diplomacy will find its way. Let's listen in to the UN Secretary General and the IAEA chief.
We need a credible, comprehensive and verifiable solution, one that restores trust, including with full access to inspectors of the IAEA as the United Nations technical authority in this field. The Non-Proliferation Treaty is a cornerstone of international peace and security. Iran must fully respect it. Yeah. And all member states must act in accordance with their obligations under the UN Charter and other rules of international law, including international humanitarian law.
The nuclear non-proliferation regime that has underpinned international security for more than half a century is on the line. The dramatic events in Iran have become even more serious with last night's bombardments and the potential widening of the conflict. We have a window of opportunity to return to dialogue and diplomacy. If that window closes, violence and destruction could reach unthinkable levels, and the global non-proliferation regime, as we know it, could crumble and fall.
Iran accused the US of destroying diplomacy, while America's envoy defended the attack as a measure to protect its citizens and allies. Iran's ambassador to the United Nations had the following to say.
States a permanent member of this council, the depositary of the NPT, and the only state that has ever used nuclear weapons, murdering millions in 2 cities, has now once again resorted to illegal force, waged a war against my country under a fabricated and absurd pretext, preventing Iran from acquiring nuclear weapons.
I want to thank our guest Walter Anderson for joining us on the programme. We will continue to bring you all updates from that developing situation. However, staying in the region, a suicide attack struck a church in Damascus, killing at least 22 people and injuring over 60. The attack happened during a packed service at the St. Elias Church in the Dwella neighbourhood. According to Syrian authorities, the attacker opened fire before detonating an explosive belt. The Islamic State group has been blamed for this unprecedented assault inside a Syrian church since the civil war began in 2011. Eyewitnesses described chaos as worshippers tried to stop the attacker. First responders rushed victims to hospitals while security forces secured the area. Here's what a resident of the neighbourhood said.
فايت من برا هو معه سلاحه، فات له هون بلش دغري يقول يا خنازير، بده يقوص، أول طلقة وقت غاروا عليه الشباب قام راح فجر حاله، وهو بعين نقطة مطرح هي الجورة. وهو فايت عم بيقول عم بيقول لنا يا خنازير، شلنا هون أسعفنا هون حمل أكثر من 10 أنا اللي حملتهم بإيدينا. الأشلاء اللي شلناها بأكياس كمان فوق ال 15 20 كيس.
The Syrian Interior Ministry called it a criminal, sinful bombing and vowed to investigate thoroughly. Let's have a look at the spokesman for the Syrian Ministry of the Interior and what he had to say.
تدين وزارة الداخلية السورية التفجير الإجرامي الآثم الذي استهدف كنيسة ماريلياس اليوم، والذي تشير المعطيات الأولية إلى كونه ناتجا عن هجوم انتحاري يتبع لتنظيم داعش. وهذه ليست المرة الأولى التي يحاول تنظيم داعش استهداف المدنيين بأعمال إجرامية فيها، فقد أحبطت وزارة الداخلية محاولتي تفجير في كل من مقام السيدة زينب وكنيسة معلولة في عمليات دقيقة ومعقدة. إننا في وزارة الداخلية نعمل مع الجهات المعنية لكشف تفاصيل الحادثة، ونعكف على استكمال التحقيقات وجمع الأدلة لتحديد هوية المنفذ.
International leaders have condemned the attack. The UN envoy called it a heinous crime, while the US envoy labelled it an act of cowardice. Turkey and France also condemned the violence, urging unity against acts like these. The Orthodox Patriarch urged authorities to protect all citizens and prevent further violations against religious sites. Security remains a critical challenge for Syria's new government amid ongoing threats. And now we turn to Europe, where Russia has carried out new strikes on Kiev and surrounding areas, killing at least 5 people and wounding several others, according to the latest reports. Ukrainian officials say the attack hit the Bilatverska district just south of the capital. A woman born in 1957 died from her injuries, according to Kiev's military administration. 2 others were also taken to hospital, while several victims were treated on the spot. Russia has not issued a statement on the latest strike, but Moscow has repeatedly said its military actions target strategic sites. The incident comes amid escalating attacks on both sides, with Kiev vowing to intensify strikes on Russian military targets. Well, that is all we have time for. We will continue to bring you all news updates from around the world. Thank you.